is all about the Cold War and decolonization. I figured I'd start on a map here to kind of set the tone and the context of what's going on, because they kind of throw some stuff out there without necessarily showing you what it looks like. But here in Europe, you can see the proverbial iron wall, or the Iron Curtain, excuse me, starting with the Berlin Wall, right? But basically, you can kind of see the border of these Soviet-controlled lands right over here: Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, with East Germany and Eastern Austria being a part of the Russian zone as well. And then you can see kind of everything on this side is going to be, for the most part, part of NATO, part of the Alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Norway, Denmark, all of Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Greece and Turkey, Britain, Portugal, while Ireland, Spain, Sweden, Finland, and Switzerland remained neutral at this time. So just kind of a context for what's going on here. Let's go ahead and talk about this section, though. Let me just pull these down. All right. Man, so many typos here. All right. So let's start with talking about bringing the war to the end. And this is all about the three major conferences, which you definitely do need to know. Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, all occurring during World War II. And this is a meeting between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, specifically Winston Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin, until the Potsdam Conference, when both Churchill and Churchill and FDR are replaced. FDR by Truman, Churchill by Clement Attlee, which gives Stalin a huge bump. But that's for a little bit. The Tehran Conference was all about kind of focusing on how to defeat the Germans. The Soviets are going to focus on Eastern Europe. British and the United States focus on Western Europe. And then the Soviets received some territory in Poland to kind of counteract some other territory lost. Yalta is a little bit closer to the end. Pretty much, they know that the Allies are going to win. And there's a huge disagreement about what should happen after Germany's surrender, which, of course, will then lead to the split of Germany into both West and East Germany. The main gist of this conference, though, is about reconstructing Eastern Europe and the defeat of Japan, because Germany's pretty much dead at this point. On what FDR wanted in Eastern Europe was free elections, self-determination, which is a continuation of the World War II ideas. If you recall, Eastern Europe was the only part of the Treaty of Versailles that allowed for self-determination of that area, and FDR wanted to continue that. He also wanted the Soviets to join against Japan, and to counter both of those, Stalin wanted influence over Eastern Europe, essentially saying, well, I don't want free elections in Eastern Europe, mostly to create a buffer zone against any potential invasion. At least that's the argument. And Stalin said, I'll help Japan, but I want a lot for it. I want Japanese islands that they had taken. I want ports in China, and ownership of the Manchurian railroads. FDR didn't really push too much on this, because he's very worried that if they were going to go to war with the Soviets, that would lead to a lot of people being very upset due to a lot of war fatigue. Lastly is the Potsdam Conference, which, again, at this point, Truman had become president, and just a month later or so, he'll drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He continues to insist on free elections in Eastern Europe. Again, Churchill's gone, replaced by Clement Attlee. The Soviets at this point have successfully occupied Eastern Europe and refuse to engage in free elections in Eastern Europe, because they have the military there, and you're going to have to go to war with them to prevent that. So nothing really to be done by Truman unless he wants to go to war, which he very much doesn't. Communists will then gain control of Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, as we saw on that map. And by the end of the war, a complete lack of trust between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, leading to a lot of aggressive rhetoric that will pretty much be the Cold War. So we got a major balance and power shift during World War II. After World War I, the United States was definitely an international leader, but they were an international leader that appreciated their isolationism. Right? They were a world leader that did not intervene in other countries. That's going to change here, as well as the introduction of the Soviet Union as the other superpower. So we see millions upon millions of people die in Europe during World War II, which obviously destroys the economy, but also leads to a lot of people migrating out, also due to fear of communism. We see a lot of people worried about that. East and Central Europe suffer the most destruction, especially Poland, Germany, and the Soviets, who each lost 10 to 20% of their whole population. Britain and France, despite suffering a little bit, they maintained their democracy, they maintained the rule of law, they maintained their universities and their corporations that allowed them to continue to be global leaders. But on the whole, what we're going to see is Europe becomes less influential due to this economic decline, and then also the move to the forefront of the Soviet Union in the United States, who take on a bigger international role than they ever previously had been able to. The Americans, in fact, suffered the least from the war, and in fact, the American economy was at its highest point, its most successful point during World War II ever. Which actually has created a lot of issues going forward because people kind of expect what the World War II economy to be the American economy when it never will be again, unless another massive global war breaks out where the Americans somehow are untouched. And so infrastructure and industry grow specifically because the government is funding contracts to the military, and also lost significantly less people compared to European nations. So all this growth during World War II allowed for the Americans to kind of flex their economic power with the Marshall Plan, which we'll talk about in a later section. But it also helps them develop atomic weapons, the first ones to do so. And 4 years after the Americans successfully deploy the atomic bombs in Japan, the Soviets get their first one in 1949. And by the end of the 40s, the Soviet Union is the only nation that can even challenge American supremacy across the world, because the Americans are just so strong economically. And pretty soon culturally. We're going to see over the course of the Cold War, the culture battle between the Soviet Union and the United States is pretty clearly going to end up in America's favor, as is most of the Cold War. But there's costs to that as well. There are a lot of advances during the war. The air pressure systems and planes, which allows us to fly commercially. Food refrigeration, a huge deal. Stronger plywood for building purposes. Plastics and penicillin, probably the two most important here at the back end. Penicillin, a huge medicine, saves millions of lives. Plastics, of course, is all around us. And all of these would be adopted by civilians, which, kind of showed people that maybe there was some benefit to wartime. So the start of the Cold War. So neither the U.S. or Soviet Union was in any position to start a full-scale war with the United States because, it still has an isolationist bent, although that's very quickly going to dissolve as the Cold War kind of rages on. And then also on top of that, yes, they had all this economic growth, but it's still good. It's going to be a much harder war to fight the Soviet Union, and so they're not trying to do that. Soviet Union, meanwhile, also recognizes that the American economy is impossible to defeat at this point in time. So no reason to do that. So this leads to a Cold War, which is all about propaganda, spying, espionage, and then an arms race, a nuclear arms race. But then on top of that, it leads to a lot of smaller wars, what we call proxy wars, right? Where basically two sides of tinier wars are fighting on behalf of either the Soviet Union or the United States. Some of those wars quite big. Vietnam, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, Korean War, but for the most part, there are a lot of internal struggles between two different groups in a society. But we'll get to more of those later. The U.S. and the USSR, though, created hydrogen bombs in the early 1950s, even more deadly than the atomic variant. And the ability to do this, especially in the United States, created a close tie between the government and the military companies. The industrial companies that helped to develop these weapons, creating a concept known as the military-industrial complex, where, for economic purposes, for the benefit of these industries, the military and the industries tended to wield a lot of power politically in terms of being able to get contracts from the government, in terms of being able to develop new weapons that maybe weren't necessarily needed, that helped the bottom line of these companies. And so Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, the last military leader to become a president, he is actually worried about this, which is interesting coming from a man who was a general. He's very concerned about the military-industrial complex taking over American political life, and that seemed pretty prescient based on what we know today. So World War One. So now we're into kind of the breakdown of empires. A little summary, but I think they're going to go into a lot more detail in a later section. World War One is the height of colonization. Africa, India, Southeast Asia. China is essentially colonized. And then Austria, Turkey, and the Russians, Ottoman Empire and Russia, had these massive multi-ethnic empires, leading to a lot of discrimination. After World War I, though, we see a lot of calls for self-determination, really bolstered by the 14 points and Woodrow Wilson's call for self-determination at the Paris Peace Conference. Again, so self-determination is just the idea that countries should choose their own government. And on top of this, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires crumbled away, which meant that their multi-ethnic empires dissolved into self-determined nations. We do see colonial powers hold on to a lot of their colonies, though, after World War I. And in fact, you see Britain and France expand into the Middle East, right? Now, during World War II, we see these colonizing states focus on Hitler and the war, which basically allowed for the colonies to grow their independence movements unchecked. And especially after World War II, when they still didn't get independence during any treaties there. And so after World War II, we see the foundation set for the end of colonies, the growth of self-determination, along with the weakening of the colonial powers due to World War II, especially Britain and France. And then on top of all that, the Cold War brought in a new angle for these nations to take, where they can use the different global powers, superpowers, to cause a lot of tension with their colonial overlords, and then also use that as leverage to gain their independence. But that's going to do it for this video 8.1. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next one.